There are moments you don't recognize as warnings until it's already over. She had been trying to tell me something for days, and I almost didn't listen. What happened next changed the way I see her, and if I'm being honest, it changed the way I see myself. She had always been a steady dog. That's the word that comes to mind, steady. Not dramatic, not reactive, not the kind of animal who barked at shadows or startled at sounds most people couldn't register. In the 11 years since she'd come into my life, she had been the most consistent presence I'd known. Mornings she waited by the back door while I made coffee. Evenings she settled at the foot of the couch, sometimes with her chin resting on my ankle, sometimes just close enough that I could feel the warmth of her nearby. She was calm in the way that older dogs become calm, settled into the rhythm of the house, as if she'd always been part of its architecture, woven into the place, woven into me. That's why, when things started to shift, I almost convinced myself I was imagining it. It began on a Tuesday evening in late October, the kind of evening that feels subtly different without you being able to say exactly why. The light going down a little faster, the air carrying a chill that hadn't been there the week before. I was sitting on the back porch with a cup of tea gone cold in my hands, watching the yard fade into dusk, when I noticed her standing at the top of the steps, not lying down, not pacing, just standing. Her ears were forward, not the relaxed sideways way they usually sat, but lifted and precise, pointed toward the far end of the yard where the fence line met a tangle of old oak and overgrown brush. I called her name. She didn't turn. That alone was unusual. She had always been responsive, not in a rigid, trained dog way, but in the natural way of an animal deeply attuned to the person she lived with. A word, a shift in my posture, even a change in my breathing was usually enough to bring her eyes to mine. But that evening she stood at the edge of the steps as if she hadn't heard me at all. Her body was rigid, her tail was low, not tucked in fear, but stilled completely, the way you go still when you're straining to catch something faint at the very edge of hearing. I watched her for a long moment, then I looked out at the yard. There was nothing there, just the familiar shapes of the old lawn furniture, the garden beds going brown at the edges, the fence, the dark outline of trees beyond, the same yard I had looked at 1,000 times, ordinary, quiet. I told myself she'd caught a scent on the wind, a deer moving through the tree line maybe, or a neighbor's dog passing nearby. These things happened. I went inside and didn't think much more about it, but it happened again the next evening, and the evening after that. Same time, same spot, same posture, ears forward, body taut, eyes fixed on the far corner of the yard where the shadows gathered earliest. I began paying closer attention. I'd watch her from the kitchen window while I washed the dinner dishes, and there she'd be, standing at the top of the porch steps, absolutely still, staring at something I could not see or hear or name. She'd hold that position for 10, sometimes 15 minutes before finally turning and coming back inside. And when she came in, she always moved differently than before. She pressed close against my leg. She settled near my feet rather than her usual spot by the door, not seeking comfort. Positioning herself, as if she were making sure she stayed between me and whatever she'd been watching. I told myself I was projecting. That's what we do with the animals we love. We layer our own anxieties over their behavior and call it intuition. She was probably just getting older, I reasoned, senses sharpening in that quiet way they sometimes do with age. Or maybe she'd locked onto some territorial scent that drifted away when the wind shifted. I ran through every rational explanation I could construct, and for a while the explanations held. But there was a moment, one still afternoon when she was resting at my feet and I reached down to scratch behind her ears, when she raised her head and looked at me with an expression I didn't quite know how to name. Not worried, not fearful. Something older and quieter than either of those things, the look of an animal who already understands, completely, and is waiting with great patience for you to catch up. I held her gaze for a second longer than usual. She held mine, then she laid her head back down, slow and deliberate. Outside, the yard was still and gold in the late afternoon light. The oak trees barely moved. Everything looked exactly as it always had, ordinary, familiar, safe. I had no reason to feel unsettled, but she did. And she was already working, in the quiet and certain way animals work, towards something I didn't yet have the eyes to see. A week passed, then another, and still, every evening, same time, same corner of the yard, she was there, watching. I had stopped trying to explain it away. Instead, I started watching with her, standing at the window while the light drained out of the sky, waiting for whatever she was waiting for. Nothing ever moved, nothing ever came, and yet she never stood down, never relaxed, never let it go. The nights were when it changed. She had always slept at the foot of the bed, close, but with the easy, settled weight of an animal fully at rest. Now she didn't sleep at all. I'd wake in the early hours and find her standing at the bedroom window, or positioned in the doorway facing the hall, or simply sitting upright beside the bed in the dark, ears forward, utterly still, listening to something I couldn't hear. The first time I woke to find her like that, I lay there quietly, watching her profile in the low light, the focused set of her ears, the slow and deliberate rise and fall of her ribs, and something moved through me that I couldn't quite call fear, something older than fear, something instinctive. I started sleeping lighter. She moved through the house differently now, not anxious, not erratic, but precise, intentional. Wherever I went, she followed, always positioning herself between me and the door, between me and the window, between me and the dark edges of whatever room we were in. At the time, I thought it was clinginess, separation anxiety, maybe. I'd read about that in older dogs. I made a mental note to call the vet, but then came the night I couldn't explain away. I was sitting up late, the house quiet around me, when she rose slowly from the floor beside my chair. No sound had preceded it, no creak, no rustle, nothing I could detect. But she rose, and she turned, and she placed herself directly between me and the back wall of the room. And then, low in her chest, barely audible, she growled, not at me, past me. I had never heard that sound from her before, not in 11 years. It wasn't alarm, wasn't aggression. It was a warning, ancient and deliberate, aimed at something behind me, in the dark, near the edge of the yard beyond the glass. I didn't move, neither did she, and the silence that followed was the loudest thing I had ever heard. I turned slowly. The room was dark behind me, the back window nothing but a black rectangle framed in thin curtains. My heart was moving fast, not pounding but present, the way it gets when your body understands something before your mind does. She hadn't moved. Still positioned between me and whatever was out there, her growl faded now into silence, but her posture unchanged, rigid, certain. I moved to the window. At first, nothing, just the yard in darkness. The familiar shapes reduced to shadows, the patio chairs, the garden border, the old fence line, the oak trees beyond it, motionless, everything exactly as it always was. I stood there for a long moment, searching the dark, and began to feel the first edge of doubt. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe she'd heard a sound carried on the wind. Maybe I had let 2 weeks of quiet unease build into something larger than it was. Then, movement, low, near the ground, at the far corner of the yard, where the fence met the tree line and the shadows were thickest. Something shifting, slow and deliberate, the way things move when they believe they haven't been seen. I pressed closer to the glass. A figure, crouched at the fence line, partially obscured by the brush but no longer fully hidden. A man, moving along the outer edge of the yard with focused, unhurried intention. Not a neighbor, not someone passing through, someone who had been there before, someone who had learned the rhythms of this property, this house, this life, and had been watching, and waiting, and testing the edges of it night after night while I slept. Everything landed at once. The evenings on the porch steps, the sleepless nights, the way she planted herself between me and every door, every window, every dark corner of every room. The growl, that low, ancient sound she had never once used in 11 years until the moment it was needed. She hadn't been anxious. She hadn't been aging strangely or reacting to scents on the wind. She had been tracking something real, something patient and dangerous, circling closer night after night, while I rationalized and explained and almost stopped paying attention. She had known. From the very first evening on the porch steps, in the fading October light, she had already understood what I was only now seeing through a dark window with my heart in my throat. I looked down at her. She was already looking up at me. Calm, steady, sure, as if she had been waiting this whole time, simply for me to finally see what she had never stopped watching. I called the police that night. They found him 2 streets over, and what they told me in the days that followed was enough to make my hands go still for a long time afterward. He had been watching the house for nearly 3 weeks, studying the patterns, the lights going off, the doors I checked and the ones I didn't, the hours I kept, patient in the way that made it worse, not better. The officer who came to take my statement looked around the house, asked his questions, and before he left he glanced down at her and said, quietly, almost to himself, "She probably knew before you did." He wasn't wrong. I've thought about that often in the months since. About how close it came to going differently. About all the evenings I stood at the kitchen window, half watching her and half convincing myself there was nothing to see. About the night I almost went to bed early and didn't sit up late in that chair. About every moment I came within reach of dismissing what she was so quietly and persistently trying to tell me. The math of it is uncomfortable. The margin was thinner than I like to think about, but she didn't let me miss it. She couldn't speak. She had no way to hand me the words, to make me sit down and understand in the direct way one person can reach another. All she had was her body, her instinct, her absolute and unwavering certainty, and the patience to keep showing me, night after night, until I finally had the eyes to see. That is a particular kind of devotion, the kind that doesn't ask for acknowledgement, the kind that simply continues, steady and sure, regardless of whether it's being understood. I think about the 11 years before that October. The mornings by the back door, the evenings at the foot of the couch, the quiet weight of her presence woven so seamlessly into my life that I had stopped noticing it the way you stop noticing your own breathing. She had always been there. And in being always there she had become in some ways invisible, not unseen but unexamined, taken for granted in the soft and careless way we take for granted the things we most depend on. I don't do that anymore. She sleeps at the foot of the bed still. Same spot, same easy weight, the deep and settled sleep of an animal fully at rest. Some nights I lie awake a little longer than I need to, just listening to her breathe, just being aware of her, the steadiness of her, the quiet, extraordinary faithfulness of her. There are all kinds of ways to be kept safe. Some of them you recognize immediately.